Welcome, universe. We are here today with Robert Whitaker, journalist and author whose career began as a medical writer for the Albany Times Union newspaper in Albany, New York in 1989. He was named a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1992, became director of publications at Harvard Medical School, and then co-founded CenterWatch, a publishing company that covered the pharmaceutical clinical trials industry. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1998, and in the early 2000s, he published his first book, Mad in America, about psychiatric research and medication. Then in 2010, he published Anatomy of an Epidemic, which won an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award for Best Investigative Journalism. Whitaker's main thesis is that psychopharmacological drugs work well to curb acute symptoms. However, patients receiving prolonged treatment courses often end up more disabled than they started. In issuing this award, the IRE said that this book provides an in-depth exploration of medical studies and science and intersperses compelling anecdotal examples. In the end, Whitaker punches holes in the conventional wisdom of treatment of mental illness with drugs. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure being here.
So the first thing I'd like to ask is something I ask everybody, which is their why, their motivation. So what was it that got you interested in researching mental illness? Why'd you get involved in this space?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. I had when I was working for a newspaper, and then even after I left the newspaper business as a regular reporter, I actually had no interest in psychiatry. What happened was when I had that company you mentioned, CenterWatch, I began to understand that pharmaceutical companies were conducting clinical trials basically to create a marketing story as opposed to really test the safety and efficacy of the drugs. So I saw the commercialization of clinical research. And then I also saw came upon some instances that were really sort of abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. So I got in, I did this series for the Boston Globe on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And I thought that was going to be it, okay? But what happened, and at that time I had a completely conventional understanding of what was happening in psychiatry, which was that we were understanding the biological causes of these disorders, such as schizophrenia. We now had drugs that fix those problems, say schizophrenia due to too much dopamine, and the drugs were like insulin for diabetes. In other words, I believe the story of progress. And what happened was, while doing that series for the Boston Globe, I came upon a couple studies that belied that story of progress. One was a study by Harvard researchers that found that outcomes for schizophrenia patients today were no better than they had been in the first 30 years of the 20th century, which belies that story of progress. And then I came upon studies done by the World Health Organization, which twice found that schizophrenia outcomes were better in 3 developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, than in the US and other rich countries. And they actually concluded, after the second study, that living in a developed country is a strong predictor you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I wanted to know, why would living in a developed country be a predictor that you're going to have a poor outcome? Much worse than if you were in rural India, okay? Much, much worse. And then, now, when I began this, my understanding was antipsychotics fixed a chemical imbalance in the brain. Everybody had to be on them for life, okay? And that should lead to better outcomes. But then you find that in the World Health Organization studies, they looked at that because after the first study, which really stunned Western investigators, they hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is they're more medication compliant. That's a valid hypothesis. If the drugs are supposed to be so essential for good outcomes, more compliance should lead to better outcomes. So they investigated medication use in the second one. And they found that in the poor countries, specifically India and Nigeria, which had the best outcomes, they used the drugs differently. They used them acutely, in other words, to curb an episode of psychosis, but not chronically. They didn't keep people on the medications long term. So this was the moment of what is going on here, where I questioned my own understanding, because I started with the understanding that everyone should be on these drugs for life. That's what I was told as a medical reporter. And now I've got research that says outcomes are better where they don't follow that protocol, that paradigm of care. So really, that was the moment I said there's something wrong or missing from the conventional history. And then there was one other thing, and this goes actually back to mind freedom. when I was doing that, and David Oakes, when I was doing that series for the Boston Globe, one of the things we had looked at were studies where they had withdrawn antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients to see how quickly they would relapse. So, of course, we thought that was an ethical violation. And I called up David Oakes to say, well, what do you think about these studies where they're withdrawing people from their antipsychotics? And David said to me, well, a lot of us don't like these drugs, and a lot of us don't want to be on these drugs. So he wasn't so willing to. The studies actually were abusive for other reasons. They abruptly withdrew. They basically wanted people to relapse. But all of a sudden, David is saying, you should see what these drugs really do. There's plenty of reason to object to being on these drugs. So this was a moment that David sort of challenged me to look into this whole story in greater depth. And one other thing as I began to go down this path was this. When you ask the psychiatrists why people don't like to take antipsychotics, they say they lack insight into their own illness, okay? You've heard this. But that's a way to dismiss the autonomy and authority and lived experience of people who are actually being treated, right? Which is always, first of all, a prescription for bad medicine, but it's also sort of wrong from a civil rights point of view and just a basic decency and humanity point of view. So David's challenge to me also said, well, maybe we need, if we're going to think about psychiatric care in this country, maybe we need to listen to the voice of those who are treated as having a value, and we shouldn't be quieting that voice. So those were all the sort of mixture of influences that led me to write Mad in America, which really was a history leading up to why are outcomes so poor today. And the other thing about this history was it valued and honored the voice of those who've been treated and their perceptions of treatments all the way back from as much as possible from colonial times till today. And of course, what you find in the history of psychiatry is you have a conventional history where those who are doing the treating say whatever they're doing, usually to quiet people, is effective. And then you have so often a totally different perspective of those who are being treated, quote, treated, who see it as oppressive, often violent, robbing of civil liberties, robbing of their right to be, etc. And one of the things I think Mad in America did is really honored that voice as a voice of reason, actually, of those who are being treated. And that's what I was really trying to do in that history as well. So it's sort of a counter history, so to speak.
Sure. Yeah. When I read Anatomy of an Epidemic, it felt like I was reading almost like a mystery thriller as you kind of go through and try to uncover these different mysteries. And let me ask you, so one criticism of your work that someone could have is, well, why read the work of a journalist instead of a psychiatrist? What do you say to people who kind of give you that, well, Bob, you're not a psychiatrist. Why should we listen to all of the research that you found?
Yeah, this especially goes to Anatomy of an Epidemic, because that's a book that reviews research. Yeah. Well, the answer is this. This is not my research that I'm presenting in Anatomy of an Epidemic. It's their research. And the reason it's there, it's psychiatry's own research. And here's the problem, and the answer is this, is psychiatry is also a guild, meaning like a trade union, that it has to promote its own interests. So the American Psychiatric Association is set up to promote the interests of psychiatry. So what is one of psychiatry's main products? Well, it's drugs. Okay, that's what they do. They prescribe. So psychiatry as an institution, it's really easy to see, is quite hesitant about making known research results that undercut societal belief in its product. So in fact, what you need is someone from the outside who doesn't have that guild interest and that same vested interest, and by the way, isn't also getting money from pharmaceutical companies to be a speaker and advisors, that sort of thing, to just come forth and say, well, here's what your own research shows. I'm just the messenger here. I'm not the one doing the research. I'm literally like the little boy who holds up points out the king has no clothes. The king has no clothes. And actually, once you start seeing it, you can see that clearly. But the king and his people around him are not going to ever, acknowledge that, so to speak. So the answer is, unfortunately, yes, it needed an outsider to come and say, look at your own research and look at how over a period of 50 years it's telling this story. And it's amazing how compelling and consistent the research is, that your medications on the whole over the long term worsen long-term outcomes. And that's true for schizophrenia. It's true for depression. It's true for basically anything you can find, it looks like.
Now, can you, one of the things I thought that was really profound about your book was that you actually went and looked at what the outcomes for these, disorders were like before drugs came out. You talked about in your book the different treatments that they had before we had drugs, and then what the actual normal course of these illnesses were. Can you tell me a little bit about what, things like schizophrenia or even depression looked like in a time before drugs, which isn't really that long ago, but in that time, can you talk a little bit about what you found?
So this is really important because you really can't know whether your treatment, your intervention is effective over the long term unless you know natural recovery rates, right? Because one of the problems is from the clinician's point of view, right? The perspective. They get someone who's in the midst of a crisis, their worst moment. And if they see any improvement, they say, well, they're better than when they came in. But that's not actually the standard you need to assess against. The standard is what happens to people over time. What is the spectrum of outcomes for people so diagnosed over longer periods of time? So you need that as a baseline to assess your own treatments. And so that's one thing I did for all of these schizophrenia depressions, go, well, what sort of outcomes were we seeing from 1945 to 1955, which is the decade before they introduced all these drugs? And what you find, for example, from 45 to 50, and this is in cross-cultural studies, by the way, it's not just the US, you see it in European, of people diagnosed with schizophrenia during that period of 10 years, right? First episode of schizophrenia, 2/3 would be discharged or even higher within 18 months. And then if you go back to that original cohort of say you have 100 people come into a hospital with first episode psychosis in 1945. Well, within 18 months, about 67, 70% would be discharged. And then if you go back and look at that initial cohort 5 years later, you'd find that about 2/3 would be out of the hospital. And by the way, this is before we had a social disability system. So in other words, they had to be working, taking care of themselves, at least to a large degree. And so what you actually see as a foil for, quote, schizophrenia before the drugs is the majority of people got past their psychotic episode, and the majority of people were able to be well enough that they could function, at least somewhat decently in society. And what you really see in the pre-drug era is about 1/3 of, initial cohort would have a time of schizophrenia and then just wouldn't have another relapse. They'd basically go on with their lives. And then a second group would be able to be out of another third, would be able to be outside the hospital, right? And they might have some symptoms, they might have some oddities, but they would function okay. And by the way, employment rates would be above 50% at this time of that initial cohort. Now, there was it seems like of that initial cohort, maybe a third that, ended up chronically ill, in other words, in the hospital. But what happens is psychiatrists only remember the chronic group. They forget about the 2/3 that get released and go on. And that's sort of their delusion. So that's why it's so important to go back and see what were the natural spectrum of outcomes, even with hospitalized depression. Now, hospitalized depression is much more severe than when we call people getting depressed and on an antidepressant today, okay? You had to be quite depressed to land in the hospital at this time. What did we see there? Well, you'd see 70, 75, 80% would be discharged within 12 months. And if we look at the long-term outcomes, about 50% of a cohort of 100 people would never have another episode. About 30% would maybe have 2 or 3 episodes over 15 years. And only about 20% would really sort of become chronically depressed. So what's the message from this? The message is, if we go back before the psychopharmacology era, in the decade before, these could be episodic disorders. They weren't chronic as a matter of course, but they got re-envisioned as chronic as a matter of course, frankly, as we began using the medications all the time. So that's why this is so important. Do our interventions over the long term improve on this sort of natural spectrum of outcomes? And what you see is they do not.
So can you tell me a little bit about what treatment looked like back before the time that we started developing drugs? What was going on in these hospitals? What what types of treatments, or even out throughout history, what have people done to help themselves?
Well, see, now this. In my answer I just gave you from 45 to 55. Okay. Now the reason you really want to focus in part on that decade is prior to this, there was this idea that people who landed in the hospital were genetic misfits. Okay. So back in the late 1800s, 1890, we started getting eugenic ideas in the United States. And eugenic ideas are that there's a group of people with bad genes. There's a group of people with good genes. And the people with good genes are the ones who are just saying, who basically it was white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were saying, we have good genes. And the people with bad genes, and they would rank them. And, it would be like people from Southern Europe, and then it would be Jews, and then it would be black people. And people with, quote, mental disorders would be seen at the bottom of this ranking of people by their genetic makeup. So once these ideas got a hold of American society, the idea was the people with bad genes needed to be prevented from breeding, from spreading their genes. We needed to encourage those with good genes to have kids and those with bad genes not to have kids. So what were the social policies that were adopted? Well, one, there were laws passed saying, quote, the insane couldn't marry, but they found that wasn't effective because no one went to, when they went to the justice of the peace to get a wedding license, they said, yeah, I'm insane. No one says that. So then they said, well, we need to lock them up. We need to put them in mental institutions and keep them there, at least through their breeding years, in order to prevent them from having kids. So what you see once this conception, this false conception takes hold is, starting in the late 1890s and 1900s, people no longer get released from hospitals, okay? So all of a sudden the idea is to keep them there. And of course they sterilize them. And we actually get all sorts of really aggressive therapies in the 1930s. We get insulin coma therapy, we get repetitive electroshock therapy, we get something called metrazole convulsive therapy, which was basically a poison that made you go into convulsions. And then we had lobotomy, which was the destruction of the frontal lobes. So what happens though? So what happens between 45 to 55 to begin to shift at least a little away from those aggressive therapies is, of course, eugenics now becomes associated with the Holocaust. And once it becomes associated with the Holocaust, it starts to become a discredited way of thinking about people. So you can now find between 1945 and 55 a switch where the idea is, let's see if we can get people out of hospitals. And that's where you start seeing the better schizophrenia outcomes. Now, depression, it's a little bit different because at least in some of the European studies of depression from, say, 1910 to 1950, there seemed to be more of a desire to get the depressed patients out of the hospital. Okay, it was the mad patients they kept locked up long term. So you can see long-term studies from that period of time as well, where you see like, 70, 80% are discharged and that sort of thing. So the answer to this is this. Within the hospital setting, there were some really aggressive brain-damaging therapeutics that were embraced in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And then we get post-World War II, I'm talking about people diagnosed with schizophrenia, this period of relative a change in thinking. And it did have to do with the Freudians as well, that started to emphasize like psychosocial care at the Boston Psychopathic Hospital. And that's when we start to see these discharge rates for, quote, psychotic patients really go up.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the revolution of these wonderful drugs coming out. And there's two different things that I want to talk about initially with these drugs. One is I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of the origin of the chemical imbalance theory and how supposedly these drugs proved that was valid. And then the other is that the way these early drugs were developed, and the way that we had a tranquilizer used as an antipsychotic and a muscle relaxant used for anti-anxiety and anti-tuberculosis medication that's now becoming an antidepressant. So I don't know which makes sense to talk about first, either the way these drugs were developed, which was not the traditional drug development model, or the chemical imbalance theory. I don't know which is a better place to
No,
start.
I think the better place to start is the development of the drugs, the discovery
Sure.
of the drugs. Because our first generation of psychiatric drugs, none of them were developed for use in psychiatry. That's not where the synthesizing of the chemicals came about. What they came about for was efforts to really fight, really sort of an antibiotic model to fight maybe a particular type of bacteria. I forget whether it's gram-negative or gram-positive, that penicillin doesn't act on. So it's another type of bacteria. That was one sort of line. Then another line was, for parasites, to kill parasites. Then another line of activity was to get a better anesthetic, to get around surgical shock. So the point was, people were investigating chemicals to serve as magic bullets for infectious diseases, okay, or illnesses of that sort. And of course, we get penicillin, which really changes medicine. So that's a magic bullet against bacteria. So now we're going to look for other magic bullets, and then we also now are knocking people out for surgery, and we're going to be looking for, can we find safer ways, basically, to do surgery? Okay. And what they find as they develop chemicals for this purposes is that they have side effects that perhaps can be useful in psychiatry. So thorazine or chlorpromazine, this comes out of an effort to, basically to find a drug that numbs you, that shuts down your emotional reaction and even sort of your physical reaction to pain, but allows you to remain conscious. And the idea is this will make for a better surgical anesthetic, because there's a worry when you make people unconscious, you have complications from that. So it's tried in surgery, and what the surgeons notice is, wow, this looks like a chemical lobotomy. In other words, it causes the same sort of indifference to the world that you see in people who've been lobotomized. Well, now at this time, lobotomy is still seen as a good thing in psychiatry, right? Because in 1949, the Portuguese neurologist who invents lobotomy, Gas Moniz, wins the Nobel Prize in Medicine. So they go, well, maybe we have a chemical substitute for lobotomy. So that's how it was first introduced. Thorazine was to cause a change in being, to make them more indifferent, because it acted like a chemical lobotomy, but that was seen as a good thing. And again, my point is, it's introduced into psychiatry because it has an effect in some other area of medicine that is now seen as desirable for psychiatric patients. And then if you look at, like the muscle relaxant that gets introduced as the first anti-anxiety agent, well, that's also coming out of research related to searching for a magic bullet, but they find a compound that basically makes mice unafraid of being shocked and not getting aggressive in being shocked. And they basically develop compounds that turn like animals normally that are aggressive into sort of indifferent animals, emotionally indifferent. And they say, this can be good for anxiety. It prevents people from having an emotional reaction. Again, it was because of an adverse effect. And as far as the first antidepressant, that was a search for a tuberculosis drug. And they noticed that when they gave this compound to people with tuberculosis, it seemed to rile them up. They became, because with tuberculosis, often you're not moving much. So they said, maybe this can be an antidepressant. So my point is, all of the discovery of the drugs, and we can see how this goes in the chemical imbalance, were discovered for other areas of medicine. They were seen as having some sort of effect on people, and usually sort of an effect an adverse effect that perturbed normal reactions, okay? You couldn't have the same engagement with the environment. You couldn't mount an emotional response. You became less able to be aggressive. Or alternatively, it seemed like with the antidepressant, maybe it made you get up and, bounce around a bit. So we see in the discovery actually agents that must be perturbing some normal function, okay? And that's why they're called initially tranquilizers, major tranquilizers, minor tranquilizers, or psychic energizers. Those were their names. But then as we move forward in this history, psychiatry starts to want to have its own magic bullets. It wants antidotes to its illnesses. It doesn't just want these tonics doesn't just want a tranquilizer. It wants to have, in the same way infectious medicine has an antibiotic, it wants its own magic pill. And here's what happens. And this leads us to the chemical imbalance theory. Researchers start to understand how the drugs act on the brain. So, for example, they understand that antipsychotics block dopamine receptors, okay? Because they induce Parkinsonian-like symptoms, which is caused by a deficiency of dopamine. So they hypothesize maybe schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. Similarly, when they investigate the first antidepressants, they find what those drugs do is they keep serotonin or norepinephrine longer in the synaptic cleft between neurons, theoretically upping this activity of what are known as monoamines. So they say maybe depression is due to too little of these neurotransmitters. The point is, watch the history go here. We have a discovery of drugs because of their adverse effects. We next discover that, in fact, they do perturb normal functioning. They're blocking dopamine receptors, or they're blocking the normal reuptake of serotonin. And then we make the grand leap, I'm talking about psychiatry, well, maybe the problem is the opposite of the perturbation the drugs are doing, okay? So they hypothesize the pathology based on what the drugs do, okay? So we say, oh, depression is due to too little serotonin. Well, what's the next step in this investigation? You have to find, do people with depression have too little serotonin before they go on the drug? And as early as the late 70s, early 80s, they were not finding that to be so. And so you find in, for example, 1984, the NIMH saying, we're not finding a lesion in the serotonergic system as a primary cause of depression. By the early 90s, we had schizophrenia researchers saying the same thing, is we're not really seeing that a lesion in the dopamine system is a primary cause of schizophrenia. So what you see in this history, and this I think is so key, is sort of a wishful thinking on the part of psychiatry that its drugs are fixing some known pathology. Then they investigate whether that's true. They actually do not find it to be so. And now here's the moment of truth. Are they going to tell the public that? Or are they going to maintain this story about chemical imbalances, which makes their drugs look very good and makes it also look like they're making such great strides in understanding the biology of mental disorders? So which do they choose? Well, they choose the marketing story and not the scientific story. And that's a moment of great betrayal. And the other element of great betrayal here is this. So they hypothesize that, say, schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. And here's what they found. They did not find any characteristic lesion before you went on the drug, but they found that once you went on an antipsychotic, it blocks dopamine receptors. Now your brain says, uh-oh, the drug is thwarting, it's blocking my normal dopamine transmission, so I have to accelerate that transmission. I have to do something to compensate for the presence of the drug. And what does it do? Well, the presynaptic neurons put out more dopamine than normal for a while. And now that compensatory mechanism seems to burn out after a while. But the receiving neurons, the postsynaptic neurons, increase their density of receptors for dopamine. So here was the bottom line. Before you go on an antipsychotic, you do not have a known abnormality in your dopaminergic system. After you do go on it, you have the very pathology hypothesized to cause the problem in the first place. And that's the same with antidepressants. You don't see a pathology or an abnormality before you go on the drug, but then the drug perturbs the system, causes an opposite compensatory reaction, and now you have the very abnormality hypothesized to cause the problem in the first place. So that's the story. And I really believe in some ways, this is at the heart of the false storytelling that has happened in the last 35 years. And we've organized ourselves as a society around that false storytelling. And that is, it's done great harm to our society and obviously to individuals.
Sure. Now, where do you think that the source of this deception is coming from? Do you think from the psychiatrists that you've talked to, do you think that they're all aware that this truth exists and then they are all actively propagating a lie? Do you think that some of them in the dark? Because some doctors I've talked to, like Chris Gordon out in Framingham, who does open dialogue, he told me that it was one of his patients forced him to read your book, and it was in reading your book that he learned about these things. So if like, where do you think that this deception is coming from? Does everybody know about it? Are there certain individuals? Like, where, this information is somewhat, it's not locked up in a safe. You were able to get your hands on it. So, like, where do you think the deception actually comes from?
Well, the deception began from wishful thinking, okay? Because psychiatry wanted to have its, antidotes to diseases, just like other. So psychiatry wanted to position itself and to think of itself as a medical specialty. We are doctors, okay? Now, what do doctors do? They treat illnesses. So once they get these drugs, in their hands, there's a younger group of biological people say, okay, we can now become doctors. And especially if we think that these are treating known brain illnesses, okay? And then, so there's this wishful thinking, which helps give birth to the hypothesis. And then even as they initially see evidence that's not showing it to be true, they keep on researching it. Keep on thinking that there's problems with their research, okay? There must be some variation. It's just not as simple. The sort of serotonergic deficiency is not as simple as they first imagined it, but it's got to be there. Same with the dopamine thing. So there's a long time, even after it's not turning out to be true, that they're still wishfully thinking and thinking they will find it, okay? Plus, the minute they publish DSM-3, they're committed as an organization to showing that there's biological causes, okay? So there's also a guild commitment and understanding this is the goal and this is what we will find, and they sort of mesh. So now people who are training in the 90s, they're being taught this, by the way. In their textbooks, they're reading about this. So no one in the doctors in training, they don't go to the source documentation. They don't have time to go back and find this, long line of research. They just read in their textbook, it says these are due to chemical imbalances. So of course they buy it, right? Now, in 1999, so that sets a lot of people out there. We have that sort of thing. Now, in 1999, if you go to the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook, it says the serotonin theory is dead. We didn't find it, okay? And they even make fun of it. They said, there's no reason to think just because you know the mechanism of action, it means the illness is the opposite, okay? So in their own textbook, it's declared dead. Now, at this moment, I don't think there's a real good excuse for not knowing that. But maybe people who've already trained don't go back. But what is American psychiatry telling us at this time? What are they telling the public? The exact opposite. They're mounting campaigns saying, we found that depression is due to low serotonin. And this is where you see the corruption, the betrayal complete. It's just so blatant. Their own textbooks saying we didn't find it, and you find them putting up on their, with the web or educational materials, depression is due to low serotonin and our drugs fix that, like insulin for diabetes. So now go forward with this story. At some point, it is increasingly understood the chemical imbalance story is not true. So now what do people say to themselves? Well, they start making excuses. They start saying, well, we have to, it becomes just a metaphor. By the way, and this is one of the things that set me on this whole thing. In 1998, I was doing that series for the Boston Globe. And my understanding was that drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain, okay? And this is like insulin for diabetes. It's just why you should never withdraw an antipsychotic. So just as that series is getting ready to run, and that was the context for the series with the Boston Globe, right? I began asking people, can you just show me where so that study had run. I said, but can you show me where you found that schizophrenia is due to too little dopamine? Or you found that depression is due to, schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. And you found that depression is due to too little serotonin. And you know what I was told? This is 1998. It's a metaphor, like insulin for diabetes. I said, I understand it's a metaphor, but tell me where you found that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine. And they would repeat, it's just a metaphor. And I said, I understand the like insulin for diabetes, but you must have found that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine. And they said this to me, no, we haven't really found that, but it's an explanation. We know the drugs are good for people, and we need an explanation to get them to take their drugs. So literally what you started to see here in their own mind was a reconciliation with the public story and the scientific story. They knew the science. I'm talking to researchers. But they provided a rationale for continuing to tell people that chemical imbalance story because it was good for them. In other words, they found a rationale for lying in a way that benefited psychiatry as a guild. And what happens is, away from research circles, ordinary psychiatrists and doctors for so long didn't realize that this was going on. That's how out of sync they are with their own research. They're actually living off of the public pronouncements, once they get trained, as opposed to whatever the actual science is showing. So that's what happens. And I'm sure that's what happened to Chris Gordon. You have a belief system you're taught, and you don't think the people doing the teaching are misleading you. And now, of course, what you see, though, is this pretense, like by Ronald Pye, saying, like, that's always a kind of urban myth. He's the former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times. He says, the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders is a kind of urban myth, never a theory seriously proposed by well-meaning psychiatrists. Well, what he's trying to do at that moment is say, well, of course we knew our own research. We knew it wasn't so. So he's trying to retain the mantle of a good scientist, okay? And then he's going to put the blame on it on the pharmaceutical companies. So it's a way of sort of, saying we're not to blame for this, an exculpatory explanation, sort of thing, an alibi for the profession. But obviously it's psychiatry told us this. But that's your answer. You personally could have been trained in the early 1990s as a psychiatrist. You would have been told they fix chemical imbalances in the brain. You would have been told this is why they have to take the drugs for life. And that's what you would have gone and done. And that's what you would have told your patients, because that's what you learned. And what the thing is, you wouldn't have gone back to the research yourself. And and you would have become unaware of what your own research actually showed.
Sure, it makes sense. Now I want to ask you, we've talked quite a bit about things like schizophrenia, a little bit about bipolar, depression, anxiety. One thing that we haven't touched on at all is attention deficit disorder. And I mean, we could talk about also how I don't mean to say that ADD is the only thing that young people are being diagnosed with. Many of them are being diagnosed with things like bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, and these things too. But I want to kind of bring into this discussion about young people and children that are being diagnosed and, kind of coerced and guilted into taking medications. What did you find in your research about things like ADHD and Ritalin and these medications?
Well, what you find, of course, is that these are the DSM-3, which is when you first get attention deficit disorder as a diagnosis. There wasn't such a diagnosis in DSM-1 or DSM-2. These, of course, are constructs, right? It's not that they found that a certain group of kids have something wrong with their brains or anything like that. Basically, they have a construct where, say, if kids aren't paying attention enough in school or fidgeting too much, that sort of thing, we're going to say they have a deficit of their attention, and then we're going to treat them with Ritalin. So what you find is it's just a way to describe, there's a spectrum of behaviors in classrooms, right? And people have different responses to classrooms. And especially classrooms, increasingly became out of sync with how children are naturally. I mean, I don't think children are really supposed to sit in a chair for 6 hours a day. Anyway, so it's just a construct. And then now they did have a drug that could quiet people, okay? It will make little kids move around less. It'll make them less engaged with their friends and all. And it can sort of make them obsessive. So you give them a math problem and they'll just focus on that one thing. So what you find is there's a construct. B, once that construct happens and it gets positioned as an illness, of course the drug companies love it, right? Because once you have an illness, you can now get a drug approved for that illness. And so suddenly the prescribing of Ritalin takes off. Then as you go forward, by the way, drug companies are now paying psychiatrists who sit on the panels to say, well, what are the symptoms of ADHD? They're paying them in essence to expand the boundaries and to be, the speakers and advisors, and getting a lot of money. And you see this. So what you really see with ADHD, it's a story about constructing a diagnosis, calling it an illness, expanding the diagnostic boundaries so you can put more kids into it. But basically, again and again, what it is it's kids that aren't behaving the way you want them in school in terms of being quiet, that sort of thing. And then, so it becomes, you can see it's a commercial story, okay? It's a commercialization of behaviors in kids and turning it into an illness and a profit center. It's a profit center for the sellers of the drugs and also for psychiatry and the psychiatrists who serves as consultants, et cetera. So example, one of the big promoters of ADHD was Joseph Biederman at Massachusetts General Hospital. He got money from every maker of ADHD drugs, and the last I looked, like in 2007 or something like that, he was getting money from 24 different drug companies. Well, he did a great job of building this market of first diagnosing kids with ADHD. Now, the second part of the story is this. If we really cared about the kids, we would want to see them doing better on the very domains we want them to do better on. We would see them improvements in school, I guess lower delinquency rates, getting into good colleges. And so we would want to see them thriving better than they would otherwise, right? And what you found very early on is Ritalin did make kids quieter in school and less annoying sometimes to teachers, but it didn't translate into better thinking, better academic achievement, happier kids. Even over the short term, you didn't see an improvement on the academic domains you want to see. And then in 1990s, the NIMH mounted something called the MTA study. And the MTA study was going to be the first well-designed clinical trial to tell us, is this helping kids grow up and thrive? Now think about what you're doing. You're diagnosing a kid, you're saying that kid is abnormal, and now you're giving a drug that's going to change that kid's brain, right? That is a profound influence on that kid's life. You're basically saying we're going to make him into something else, okay? Now you better have pretty good evidence. I mean, we can even get into whether you should be doing that at all, okay? But if you're going to conceive it this way, you should see good outcomes, all right? Outcomes in terms of academic achievement by some social norms, et cetera. So what did you see in the MTA study? You saw at the end of 14 months, so they had one group that's treated with behavioral therapy and one group with drugs, right, basically. And at 14 months, maybe the group treated with drugs was doing a little bit better on reading and then had a little bit less ADHD symptoms, okay? And they said, the drugs provide a long-term benefit. But by the end of 3 years, being on drug was a marker not of benefit, but of deterioration. In other words, the medicated kids were having worse ADHD symptoms, et cetera. By 6 years, you saw it as worse ADHD symptoms, higher delinquency rates, they were shorter, and they had signs of functional impairment. So you were making kids worse, right? And this was the study that is still cited today as showing your kid needs to be on Ritalin or a stimulant because they cite the 14-month. They don't cite the 3-year or 6-year results. So what did I find here? You asked me what I found. What I found was a disorder that was constructed. I found a disorder where the boundaries were expanded with each successive, you have DSM-3, then 3R, then DSM-4, and you see the boundaries widening and the number of kids getting diagnosed higher, higher percentage. Then you go to the research, you find out you're not helping those kids, okay? And in fact, the long-term study says you're making them worse, and that doesn't get publicized. So what you find is you have a story that, in essence, converted otherwise healthy kids into drug consumers, gave them a sense that there was something abnormal about them and that maybe they would have to take these short drugs for life, and your research showed you weren't helping those kids. So what's that a story of? That's a story of seeing kids as a potential market for a product, converting a number of kids into consumers of that product, and not giving a damn about what you're doing to the kids. I think it's one of the worst betrayals I've ever seen. And what's so amazing is this idea has now been exported around the world. I mean, they're diagnosing kids with ADHD everywhere. But you can see I'm getting on my soapbox. You're taking kids who have a right to be, and a right to grow up, and a right to struggle, and a right to figure out how to, to grow into their own brains and make choices. You're taking that away from those kids. So you're literally taking away sort of their God-given right to make something of themselves and to experience life fully, and to not see them through this lens of illness. And you're doing it really for commercial reasons. It gives psychiatry expanded domains, creates a market for pharmaceutical companies, but you can't even show you're helping those kids. And I just think it's one of the most amazingly harmful, tragic, sad, and betrayal things I've seen in our country in a long time. And finally, by the way, I'm not even adding in we didn't have juvenile bipolar until we started giving them stimulants and antidepressants. And we know that stimulants can cause psychotic, manic reactions. And when that happens, aggressive reactions, they get diagnosed with bipolar. So now you've literally taken a healthy kid and made him into a person with mood dysregulation. And they're going to be on things like antipsychotics and said to have an illness for life. Think about how awful that is.
So what do you think of this kind of approach? It seems like some of the research I found showed that like when NAMI came out, they were a big supporter of the idea of the medical model and having a biochemical imbalance, because before that, people thought, oh, it must be the family. It must be the parents that are causing the kids to have these disorders. And then by having this idea of a biochemical imbalance, you say, oh, it wasn't us. There's something wrong with the kid. But then at the same time, you're not telling the kid, oh, it's your fault. You're saying, hey, you're a victim of this disorder. There was nothing you could do about it. You're just born this way. I don't know, is that something that you've seen consistent in other kind of, not just with kids, but with adults too, this idea of, oh, we're kind of taking the blame away from you. It's not your fault. It's not parents' fault. It's nobody's fault. You just got dealt the shitty hand, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Listen, first of all, so when NAMI comes along in the 1880s, and it's a real grassroots thing initially by some mothers, there was something called the schizophrenic mother, right? Under sort of Freudian ideas. So the idea was that a person became psychotic because the mother was so, treated the kid in certain ways, okay? So the blame was placed on the mother. So once the chemical imbalance story starts to be mentioned, that it's due to, and we get a book in 1984 called The Broken Brain by Nancy Andreasen. That's when it really publicly hits. It's just chemicals in your brain are awry. They're, of course, going to grab onto this because the mothers are being unfairly blamed, okay? So this does give them a way to see their kids and themselves in a different way, right? It's sort of like a fate thing. And it's not related to bad families. It's not related to bad parenting. And so, of course, that's going to be attractive to a lot of suffering parents, okay? Well, the drug companies and the American Psychiatric Association immediately realized we got to make common cause with NAMI, because NAMI can be our moral voice to promote this, biological model. So they immediately start sending money to NAMI and courting them as an ally, because they understand now they got 3 legs for this storytelling. They've got the parents, provide moral authority. You're not going to question the parents, right? Because they're suffering. And then you have the academic prestige of academic psychiatrists, and then you have the money of the pharmaceutical companies. That combination is going to be great at creating a story. So they basically co-opted NAMI into this. And yeah, it became, it's a no-fault model, right? And that, by the way, that fits one other thing, and this with depression too and anxiety. It fits societal interests because you don't have to make a more just society. You don't have to fix your schools. You don't have to have better pay for people, okay? You don't have to have good housing. You don't have to worry about poverty. So if someone's depressed because they can't take care of their family, they're working 2 jobs, they're living in a shithole, bad place. It's not societal conditions. It's not societal organization that's the problem. You have a problem with the chemistry in your brain. Same with the kid. You can build a school, right? That doesn't have gym, that doesn't let kids go out and play, doesn't have music, doesn't have art, just basically tells the kids to sit down, feeds them crap, by the way, at lunch. And then when that kid's antsy and is, disengaged, it's the kid's fault. It's not how you've organized your schools. So it also fits a lot of needs, so to speak. It's a no blame model, and it's a no societal blame model. It's all in the individual. Supposedly we have a solution. So yeah, it replaces difficult questions, complex thinking, societal responses, and societal sort of responsibility to build a healthy society, and just places it all on this mysterious chemical. And by the way, it serves a capitalistic need because you create a great big market as well. So that's the functioning behind this. The problem is, once you have that story, it's completely out of sync with what we all know to be true. All of our lived experience tells us that we respond to our environments, right? We respond to, if you grow up in it. One of the things when I was doing Anatomy of an Epidemic that struck me was the number of kids, not just trauma in the home, but also where school wasn't a safe place for them. They get bullied in school, that sort of thing. But everyone I talked to, and I did 70, 80, interviews for Anatomy, personal stories. They all had stories. No one just said it developed out of all of a sudden, it was I had this traumatic thing, or I suffered in this way. One person told me he did something very bad. He injured someone by being an asshole, okay? He felt ridden with guilt. And actually, he descended sort of into psychosis as a way to deal with his extraordinary guilt over having seriously harmed someone by doing something horribly. My point is, we all know that our moods, our thoughts, that we're sort of creatures that respond to our environment, which includes, by the way, sleeping, it includes eating, but it also includes, are we in a world where we have someone to love, some meaning, safety, or are we in a perilous world where we don't know people we can trust, even the people we should trust aren't very trustworthy, we go into school, we're getting bullied. We all know that, in fact, we are environmental creatures. And this new story said the environment doesn't matter. That's how crazy it was. But it served these other purposes.
Yeah, and something that I saw in your writing too that kind of matches this is this idea that psychiatry is claiming that they've solved these problems, and that they've cured these issues. Yet, if you look at the disability numbers, it seems, from what I've read, that the numbers actually tell a completely different story. And I don't think we talked about that aspect of your research was looking at, as these drugs come out, what happens to disability numbers. Can you share a little bit about what you saw in your research there?
Yeah, this begins this actually is a good way to start putting the whole conventional paradigm under a microscope, because the conventional paradigm says we've identified the biological causes. We now have very effective drugs for treating that, and they're effective over the long term. Now, that's a medical model, if true, that should say that illness will become less of a burden in society, right? You're better at diagnosing it. You're better at treating it. So the burden of illness should go down. Polio vaccine goes down, right? Deaths due to bacterial infections when antibiotics are introduced, they go way down. All right, you see the burden of that illness go down. So if that's so, we should see the burden of mental disorders go down, since, we made these discoveries about chemical imbalances and we greatly increased the use of these drugs. Instead, what you find on every single measure you can find, the burden of mental disorders is going up, not down. And I just focused on the disability numbers as a sort of a clean way of looking at this, right? A very sharp way, because you get declared eligible for disability due to a mental disorder because you're said unable to function. So it seemed like sort of a governmental decree saying this person can't function. And so what do you find? You find that it has gone up, the number of people unable to function as a percentage of the population, dramatically ever since the introduction of even the first generation drugs, okay? And then in particular since the arrival of the second generation drugs, Prozac in 1987. Now, Prozac arrives in 1987. It's heralded as this great wonder drug. In 1987, we spent $800 million on psychiatric drugs in this country. By 2010, we were spending about $40 billion on psychiatric drugs. That's a 50-fold increase, okay? And we went from just a few percentage of people on psychiatric drugs to where 15% maybe of the population is taking them on a daily basis, right? So what happens to disability numbers? Well, you find that between that time, they go from about 1.25 million adults to over 4 million by 2007, and now it's over 5 million adults on disability due to mental disorders. Instead of decreasing the burden, it's going way up. How about children? We didn't used to medicate children. Well, in 1987, there were 16,200 children receiving an SSI payment due to being disordered by, disabled by a psychiatric disorder. Now we begin diagnosing ADHD, juvenile bipolar, and all this. Now there's 700,000 by 2010. So this incredible increase. And if you look at the kids who get diagnosed and on disability, when they hit age 18, about 2/3 just go on to adult disability. It's like this new career path is opened up. Now, so that at the very least raises questions. Why are you seeing this astonishing rise in the number of people on disability due to mental illness? And now you want to look, well, how do the drugs affect things? And really what you find is two things. Antidepressants, antipsychotics increase the risk that a person will become disabled. And antidepressant stimulants increase the risk that someone will turn from a milder disorder, say depression or depressive episode, into bipolar. And then once you're into bipolar, you're into a more chronic illness. And then finally, you do see that the way we treat bipolar today, with usually polypharmacy, leads to much greater disability than what you used to see with old manic depressive illness. So what you see is, with our current paradigm of care, worsening chronicity, greater risk of disability, and in fact, making people go from milder problems to more severe problems with this paradigm of care. Now, finally, when I first published this in 2010, people said, that's just in the United States, you're a Darwinian society, people are going on disability to get help and access to healthcare. Well, then I began looking at it in other countries, in every single country, Scandinavian, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, that has adopted this paradigm of care has seen a sharp rise in the number of people on disability due to mental disorders, showing that it's a variable independent of the social structure. In other words, you're not seeing this disability just in the US, which has, lack of access to healthcare, that sort of thing. You're seeing it in Sweden, Norway, countries, Denmark, which have some of the best access to care. So that alone tells us, you add all this up, it tells you have to rethink this whole paradigm of care. It's not working for us on any measure. Instead, it's making us sicker, it's making us less resilient. And think about one final thing, Jim. We like to say it's not the person's fault, right? But that's actually a message that you can't do anything. That's actually a hopeless message. You're just the victim of your chemicals. And it takes away the truth of the matter is that human beings are incredibly resilient. Read any of your Shakespeare, your novels, your history, your Bible, and people suffer all the time. Horrible emotional episodes, horrible heartbreak. But they're time, and so often human beings can change things and then they move into a different state. So we're not some steady state creature. And we make changes, and so often there's an incredible inner resilience within us. This model takes away that any sense of inner resilience and the capacity, to find paths to wellness, so to speak.
Yeah, it's really sad. I've read hearing you say a lot of these things is more painful than reading it. It's hard. And not that I'm not enjoying this conversation, but it is hard to hear a lot of this stuff out loud. Another topic I wanted to talk with you about, and these two sort of go together, I think, is some of the long-term studies that were done, like the work by Martin Harrow, and then also the withdrawal studies showing kind of what happens when people go off of these drugs, and then how, and I know that you even recently wrote something that you published on Mad in America about a recent study, I think in the Lancet, that talks about kind of withdrawal studies. So I don't know if you want to talk about these two topics at the same time.
No, they should go in the same time.
Overlap.
So, of course, the psychiatric profession wants to say we're evidence-based and we have our evidence for long-term use. And what their evidence comes from is a very particular type of study. They take people who've stabilized well on meds and antipsychotics. This goes back to the late 60s, by the way. And then they randomize. One group they take off the antipsychotic, and the other group they, keep them on the antipsychotic. And with great regularity, the people withdraw and relapse faster. Within 6 months, they'll have a return of a psychotic episode. Most of it happens, by the way, within the first month. And they say, see, you take away the drug, the disease returns. Okay, and that became the evidence base for long-term use. But the I lost you. I lost you there just for a second.
Yeah, something glitched there, but it seems like it's back.
It's probably my hot zone here.
Okay.
So anyway, going back to I don't know where you lost me, but the withdrawal studies are like this. I mean, this is the evidence base for long-term use of antipsychotics. You take people who are stabilized well on the drug, you randomize half to being abruptly withdrawn, the other half is maintained on the drug. The group that is abruptly withdrawn with great regularity relapses faster, meaning there's a return of psychotic symptoms. So doctors say, see, you take away the drug and the disease returns. But are you seeing a return, quote, of the disease, or are you seeing people who've had their brains changed by being on the drug, being exposed to excess risk of a relapse due to withdrawal symptoms? And clearly it's the latter, right? We all know that once you're on this drug, that you're at greater risk, when you come off, particularly abruptly. So literally they have done trials that proved what they want to see, and they've really ignored this with that this is, their understanding is being confounded by withdrawal symptoms and the fact that the person's brain has been changed. Now you get another type of study, right? And these actually go back to the 70s as well. What happens if you don't initially put people on meds and you follow that group of people? Well, even in modern studies, you find that basically about 2/3 with psychosocial care will get through the psychotic episode, not need to go on the drug, and that group will have the best outcomes. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is if you give people experimental care and try to basically minimize long-term use of drugs, and some people get off, that form of care will produce overall a better spectrum of outcomes than our usual conventional care, which says medicate everyone. And finally, in that experimental care, it's the non-medicated, those who are able to get off, who have the best outcomes. Now, Martin Harrow's study was just a naturalistic study, but of course, some of the people with schizophrenia or milder psychotic disorders took themselves off. And once again, they had much better long-term outcomes. Now, one of the key things here is this. It doesn't show up so much at the 2-year mark. So this is all naturalistic. Harrow just says people are treated in 2 hospitals. They're treated conventionally with drugs. They're discharged. Now he's just going to follow them up. But some people are just going to take themselves off. At 2 years, the people who've taken themselves off aren't really much better than the people still on. But this is the moment in the literature that is so key. Between year 2 and 5, the off-med group improves a lot on every symptom, okay? Psychosis, anxiety, cognition, work-related, presence, whereas those on meds do not continue to improve. So it's between this year 2 and 4.5 where we see a natural healing process that doesn't happen in the medicated patients. And you don't see that natural healing process in the relapse studies, right? The relapse studies just tell you if you're on drugs and you go off abruptly, or even with some like 2 or 3 week gradual withdrawal, you're at high risk of relapse. But it doesn't tell you, are you functioning? And how are you doing at 2 years, 4 years, 5 years? Do you have a good social life? How's your anxiety levels? What are your psychotic symptoms? That sort of thing. So Martin Harrow gives us a better picture of what happens over the long term, and it's quite compelling. Now, when Martin Harrow came out, people said, oh, that's a naturalistic study. It's not randomized, and all sorts of complaints. Well, I think there's now 7 long-term studies out there, and they all come to the same conclusion. If you want to maximize your outcomes for people diagnosed with the first episode of psychosis, schizophrenia, you need to try to minimize long-term use, because it's always the group the group off meds long-term as a whole is better than the medication compliant group. And you see that over and over and over again. And the question is, well, what percentage of people of that first episode group maybe could end up medication free, like 2 years, 5 years later? And the best example of that is open dialogue, and about 80% of their people are off meds by year, long term. And 67% of their first episode patients were never put on in the first place. So there's a selective use model that improves outcomes dramatically, fits with HARO, fits with the other long-term studies. And so my point is this, is if psychiatry wanted to be evidence-based and they wanted to maximize the spectrum of outcomes, they would have to adopt protocols that really tried to treat first episode for a time without drugs, and two, tried to minimize long-term use. But instead of doing that, they're wedded to their, our drugs are essential model. And so they discount all this and they try to go back to their relapse studies to find something that, gives them support for what they want to do.
Sure. Let me ask you this. We talked a little bit about kind of these different populations of people, and we mentioned children. One thing that I saw actually, I guess I could even just quickly share my screen so you could see what I'm looking at here.
By the way, I got about 15 more minutes. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I noticed this is the, what do you call it? This is the announcement that they put out, or their program for the APA conference that's going on. And so they talk about these different tracks that they're going to be discussing. And, they have addiction psychiatry. We talked about children and adolescents. Consultation is where they've got, people with multiple disorders, and you're kind of dealing with that. Then they have forensic psychiatry here and geriatric psychiatry. And those are two that I wanted to ask you about, because, it does seem like, okay, we're going after people who have drug problems. We're going after children. We're going after adolescents. We'll go after people in jails. We'll go after, people that are in nursing homes. I don't remember in your research what you had said about people in prisons and people in places like nursing homes and the rates of usage of psychiatric drugs in those places. Did you come across anything in your research about those populations?
Yeah, sure. The reason I didn't is because, especially in anatomy, I was trying to focus on the heart of their own evidence base. And the heart of their own evidence base is for people diagnosed with schizophrenia and in hospitals being discharged. Mm-hmm. Because if any place there should be a solid evidence base supporting that use, it's where you're talking about the core group of people, right? And when you start moving into prison populations or geriatric populations, well, then you're more likely to find, less evidence, so to speak, because it's not even the target audience. And what you do find, of course, is greater, I don't know if that's the right word. The harm becomes more visible as you move into the geriatric or the prison setting. So start with the geriatric settings. We know that antipsychotics, double the risk of mortality, right? So people in nursing homes on antipsychotics die quicker. Now, they may make it easier to staff nursing homes, okay, because people are not moving around as much and that sort of thing. And society in some ways isn't really invested in keeping people alive in nursing homes. So, but that's what's going on with nursing homes. First of all, it increases mortality. Second of all, it ruins their lives. The poor people, they're older. They would like to have some sort of awareness of their surroundings, right? And, they're in essence, that their cognition now is being further impaired as they grow older by the drugs. So, yeah, I understand it makes it nursing homes being able to run with less staff, but that's what's going on there. It's a management tool. With prisons, by the way, I worked in prison when I was out of college. I worked in Attica prison, which was a tough prison. Virtually no one was medicated there. And this was in the late 70s. And the reason no one was medicated was because the idea was, first of all, this was a time they talked about rehabilitation and helping people get, high school equivalencies and even go on to college. The understanding was So many of these people had just grown up in bad social situations, or social situations where selling drugs was sort of the norm, et cetera. So they weren't being pathologized like they are today. So the diagnosing of people in prisons, which is happening willy-nilly now, right? I mean, it's happening with great frequency in prisons. Well, one, it does serve management purposes. Basically, if you dole people out, right? Maybe it's easier to manage the prisons with fewer people. What it's doing to the people who are imprisoned is making their lives even more dismal. Both their, because usually it's antipsychotics we're talking about, okay? In other words, their ability to sort of like repair themselves in prison and think about what they can do differently. And then when they get out now, they have another problem. They've already got the stigma of being an ex-felon, right? And all the difficulties that is. But now what? They're on antipsychotics and they're coming off of antipsychotics. They got a diagnosis. So what the use in geriatric populations in prison shows is that antipsychotics so often are being used for, population control purposes and not to treat diseases. And it just becomes so evident that that's really the social goal there. And it's not about helping the individual, it's helping those institutions, man. That's what that's about. It's also a market, though. I mean, it's of course being done as seen as helpful for diseases, and pharmaceutical companies working with psychiatrists have just gone after one subpopulation after another. So you start with your core group of schizophrenia, psychotic people so diagnosed. Then you got to go into children. Then you got to go into bipolar. Of course, then we even have depressed patients on antipsychotics sometimes. And then geriatric, then prison populations. Imagine you're working for a pharmaceutical company. Once you get your target audience, you're always looking for these other audiences. And so that's what this is about. It's about a successful commercial enterprise at great cost to individuals, but that's what's going on.
One thing that kind of gives me hope is things like activism and organizing and some of the alternatives that are out there. And one story that I read that you wrote about in Anatomy of an Epidemic, and I've been involved a little bit with Mind Freedom, was the hunger strike. And it felt like, here's a story of them calling the powers that be accountable and making them speak and be held accountable. And I know about the story, but most people don't. And so my question is, can you tell me a little bit about the story of the hunger strike? And then as a journalist, why do you think that hasn't gotten more attention?
Yeah, the hunger strike, I was around even when they were planning it, to be honest with you. I knew this from the start. The hunger strike was, I think, a brilliant idea in terms of a public relations thing. Because hunger strikes, we know that people are putting their necks on the line for something that they see as terribly unjust, okay? So it was a sort of very sort of, visible way of protesting. And it was calling the central, lie into account. It was like, okay, show us that we have chemical imbalances. Show us these, they had some other things, but at the heart of it was show us that we have these chemical imbalances. And what happened is, of course, then they sent them secondary references. And people said, yeah, well, someone says chemical imbalance, like some textbook or something. And they said, no, send us the science. And then they cut psychiatry, basically backed off. They no longer engaged with them. I honestly think that was part of the end to the public story of chemical imbalances, the freedom strike. I think when they were shown by, a small group of people that are so used to being discounted, that mighty psychiatry couldn't answer them, that had a real impact, I think. I really do. I think it really helped set the stage for a larger discounting of the chemical imbalance story. Now, it got a little bit of play. I think the Washington Post might have covered it. I can't quite remember. Why didn't it get bigger play? It didn't get bigger play because people who have been in mental hospitals or seen as having had this diagnosis of schizophrenia, they're just discounted in societal sort of discussions. And the discount starts with they're not reliable. They're not reliable witnesses. They're crazy. They're mad people. They're nuts. So why should we listen to them? And that's actually a message, of course, that's promoted by psychiatry itself in order to justify forced treatment, right? These people don't know what's good for them. So the irony is psychiatry talks about not stigmatizing people. They run anti-stigma campaigns. And at the heart of everything they do is stigmatizing, because these people aren't even valid witnesses of their own lives. And unfortunately, journalists, they're used to calling on doctors to be their experts when they do their stories. And so it's hard to imagine that doctors at these prestigious universities are wrong and a ragtag group of people who used to be in hospitals are right. So it's hard to put your journalistic prestige, so to speak, on the line and give some credibility to this disenfranchised, this stigmatized group who society as a whole is taught to fear, right? These people are violent, they're crazy, they disrupt things. So, if a group of nuns do a hunger strike or a group of priests, they sort of bring a societal moral sort of, cloak to the whole process. Unfortunately, people with this diagnosis or, had time in a mental hospital are stripped of that societal protection. And the other thing is, finally, is, our society is not very good about really listening to the afflicted parts of our population. Poor people, minority people, they have a hard time getting on the stage. And that remains true today. We see it all the time. How often do you see people, you might write about the poor, but how often do you really hear from the poor? Okay? And that's the difference. And this was, the hunger strike was asking the general public to hear them and hear their reason and hear their sense of having been falsely told what was wrong with them. And society just wasn't set up to hear them. I'm pretty amazed that even the Washington Post, I think the Washington Post did do a bit of an article. But just to finish, psychiatry got humiliated by that hunger strike. No question about it.
Okay. So the last thing I want to ask, and we've talked a lot about the negatives, about a lot of unfortunate things. Can you tell me about what things make you hopeful and optimistic about the present and the future, things that are positive, that are happening and changes?
Well, the biggest thing that I think is happening that makes me hopeful is the old story's falling apart within the public, piece by piece. And increasingly, you see that happening. So, we did see the article in the New York Times about withdrawal problems from antidepressants a week ago. That wouldn't have run 10 years ago. There was an NPR thing about antidepressants. What do we know about their long-term effects? Now, before it would have been just saying, of course they're great. Now they were saying, well, we don't really have evidence on that. That's a change. The chemical imbalance story really has collapsed. There was a recent United Nations report by a special rapporteur, and I actually know how this report got started, which said we need a new narrative. The old ones failed. You even see in psychiatric journals now saying, maybe we need to rethink antipsychotics, like the British Journal of Psychiatry. British Journal of Psychiatry even had an editorial saying it's time to call this revolution over, and we're not quite sure what it ever achieved, but we need to move on. So the narrative that has really driven us, in particular since 1980, which was when the publication of DSM-3 came out, we're going to call these things brain illnesses, and then we get the chemical imbalance stories, these drugs are so safe and effective. That story has fallen apart. And it's fallen apart in to different degrees among different people, but really it's fallen apart completely in the scientific literature, at least 90%. And you hear more and more discussion about what are the problems. I mean, I was asked to give a talk to the parliament, work group in the parliament, the UK's parliament, because they're asking what's going on. So the biggest thing that makes me feel hopeful is I think the narrative we've organized ourselves around for the last 35 years has fallen apart or is falling apart. And when a narrative falls apart, now people have an opportunity to say, well, what can we do differently? It opens up a new discussion. And I think increasingly we're moving towards that new discussion. Maybe it's one halting step at a time, but we are moving towards it. And then you are seeing these sort of new programs springing up, even at some government levels. You had this program in Norway where the government ordered medication-free wards for people who don't want to be on the meds. There's a group there that is now in southern Norway is regularly trying to taper even their chronic patients down or off and having very good results. You have in Israel this springing up of a Soteria Israel initiative. There's something like 7, they either are called Soteria homes or stabilizing villages, but they're basically all motivated by the idea as A, let's keep people out of the hospital. B, let's see if we can turn these into episodic problems, and not just see them as chronic illnesses. And 3, drugs are more of a tool as opposed to the answer in these places. They're saying that you need to create environments. So I hear government increasingly being a little bit unhappy with this narrative care. I see organizations with some authority being unhappy with this form of care. Within psychiatric research circles, it's basically fallen apart, story we've organized ourselves around. And I see a lot of people searching for new ways, humanistic ways. The peer movement at its best is like, can we help each other and can we, create our own communities? In some ways, at its best, it goes back to Judy Chamberlain and On Our Own, which is, okay, we can't rely on others. We'll help each other. That's great. Mind freedom's continuing existence is great. So that's where I'm optimistic, is that we can look back and we can see an extraordinary tale of harm, corruption, and betrayal, which is now falling apart at the presence. And now good people, there is this fertile soil for like, what can we do different? So that's what I find hopeful.
Great. That was great. Listen, I am so grateful that you were willing to do this interview. It feels like a great privilege to be able to talk with you about these subjects.
You're very well informed and your questions are great. Can I add one last thing that you can?
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's anything else that I should have asked you.
Why I'm hopeful is actually historically the voice of people who've been treated has been discounted, okay? And it's been discarded and it doesn't even enter official histories. One of the ironies, I think, of this great pathologizing of American people and kids is now it didn't just hit sort of really marginalized people. Increasingly we have people coming from, middle class, even upper middle class homes getting pathologized. And now that group is helping lend a voice because that group comes from a different part of society that's a little better at getting its, being heard. It's helping create a larger movement, which has always been there, especially since the psychiatric survivor movement, of we need to listen to people who, have been there, who've been diagnosed, and what it's been like for them, and what did they find helpful, and what are their responses. And so I think there is much more of a willingness to listen to the voice of people who've been treated than was true 25 years ago, and that's very hopeful too.
Great. So let me ask this: if people want more information about your work, where can they find more out about you?
Well, the easiest way is to go on Mad in America. You can go About Us. There's a thing that says Bob Whitaker there. Click on that, and there you can you can find some information there. You can find source materials for the books, but then you can also go from there to something called robertwhitakerbooks.com, and there I have. So I've written a couple books outside of psychiatry. So you can find source documents for those other books, also the psychiatry books. Sometimes I keep my speaking schedule up there on both Mad in America and on robertwhitakerbooks.com. So that's where they can go. But Mad in America is hopefully a resource, many types for people.
Cool. And I'm going to be actually having Kermit Cole on here to do an interview with too. So
he was the guy that really helped Mad in America come to life. So that's great. You're going to talk to him.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob, for being a part of this. I really appreciate it.
Hey, your questions were great, Jim. Really, really wonderful. It's great seeing you doing this.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.